everyone. Welcome to the Character Clearinghouse interview, which is an online resource related to the moral development of college students. My name is Josh Davis. I serve as the Associate Editor for the Character Clearinghouse, and I am current second year's master's student here at Florida State. I'm here joined today by Shermin.
Hi, I'm Shermin Murji. I'm a doctoral candidate in the Florida State University Higher Education Program as well, and my graduate assistantship is in the Office of the Vice President of Student Affairs.
And so we're overjoyed to be interviewing Dr. Atira Charles today. Would you like to say hello?
Hi everybody, how are you? I'm Dr. C and I'm excited to be here today.
So we have a few questions that we're going to just chat with you about.
Okay.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on right now? What are some of the projects that you have your fingers in?
Yeah, so the biggest project that I have my hands in right now is called the Mask Project. And the Mask Project is a national campaign, national initiative, national research effort to bring light to this idea of people wearing masks at work and life in their academic spaces. I originally started doing research and consulting in this area of identity and how people hide or conceal or manage or strategize using the different masks and identities that they have. And I realized that I was only able to have this conversation in a research project, or if an organization called me in to do consulting or do a workshop. But I felt like it was a conversation that needed to have more legs for anyone who could just kind of search it and find it online, or anybody who wanted to share their story. So I created the Mask Project, and to date we've collected over 700 narratives of people who have shared their stories. It originally started with professional women of color because that was my initial exposure to the phenomenon. I had done a series of things with Black women in the corporate space, and I said, oh, this would be an amazing way to bring this to light. But as time went on and I started doing things in different spaces, I realized that the conversation had a wider scope, and it didn't matter who it was, that this experience was real. Now, that does not negate the nuanced and specific experience of each demographic group, because I do feel that professional minority women have a different experience because there's a double stigma, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other people that have another set of double stigmas, right? So it may be being an introverted single mother that is the two stigmatized identities in somebody's life, or it may be the hotshot on Wall Street that didn't go Ivy and didn't get raised by privilege, but is now having to navigate Wall Street as a white male that's not privileged, you know, in that way. And so there's all these different ways that it manifests, and so that's definitely where all of my time and passion is going into right now.
So what are your personal experiences with student activism? So the 2016 Institute revolves around student activism and advocacy. So what are your involvements with whether as a student, faculty, or staff?
So it's interesting, you know, when I saw the theme for the conference and I saw this idea of, you know, activism and advocacy, I think a lot of times we think about activism and advocacy as this very visible, vocal thing. And I think there are a lot of ways that people passively advocate and passively, you know, can become activists. And so the way in which I've chosen to involve myself in activism and advocacy is empowering people to use their voice, right? And that's because individually, we can all have a thought about what should be in the world, but my view is that you can have the thought, but if people can't hear it, see it, read it, where is it going? And so I've chosen in kind of the supply chain, right, of thought and activism to really help empower people to advocate for themselves first. See, that's another thing. A lot of times we think about advocacy and activism in this larger collective global societal level when there are people who aren't even advocating for themselves and are, you know, subject to oppressive ways of being, be it in their work environments, be it in their family and their relationships, all of those types of things. So the reason that I focus on self-awareness and identity is that people can utilize their voice and advocate for themselves first, because once you can do that, now when issues and themes emerge in the larger society, you already have practice, right? Because you've been doing that for yourself.
Sure. So building off that, how would you encourage staff, students, faculty to have their voice, to gain their voice?
So the first piece is unmasking. So that's one of the things I talk about a lot. And it's this idea of becoming aware of all of the different masks that you wear and all of the different ones that can impact your ability to effectively help, right? So if we think about, and I don't mean masks as in just our identities, or I'm talking about our experiences, our value sets, our beliefs, our worldviews, our biases, all of the life experiences. All of these things inform who we are. All of these things inform the way in which we present ourselves to the world. And some of those things are detrimental to our ability to help. And some of those things are barriers that get in our way of connecting and aligning with the students that we engage with in a way that allows them to feel comfortable with sharing their needs, and then also us to be able to understand it in this compassionate, understanding way and be able to help them. Because I think a lot of times people keep difference because they're different instead of trying to find where are those points of identity alignment that can create that bridge. And I think right now we just have a lot of bridges burning, you know, because of the larger societal issues. And I think that we have to start to become more constructive in how we build these bridges with each other. But that can't happen if people aren't clear about the baggage that they're bringing in to the situation.
And you mentioned some of the current events that are happening.
Yeah.
And a lot of those current events are sparking social movements that are happening, whether across the country or across the world. So are there any that particularly stand out to you? And if so, why?
So I would say that, I mean, they all stand out to me very strongly. So I just want to make that clear. But I think the thing that stands out, that has been standing out to me the most, is the Missouri situation. And I think that it stands out the most because one of the things that I often talk about is people being emotionally and psychologically safe. And what I really gathered is that in this university context, the students weren't feeling emotionally and psychologically safe. And that wound up transferring into not feeling physically safe. And when I think about students who wake up in the morning and just want to go to school, but they have an identity that is under attack, right? And not necessarily, you know, a physical someone chasing you attack, but all the messaging, the culture, the climate, the tone, the artifacts of culture all signal to you that you don't matter, or you are lesser than. There's no way you can function. I mean, it's basic Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When you don't feel safe, how can we expect these students to self-actualize when their basic needs aren't being met? So the biggest thing that stood out to me during the initial, you know, Missouri situation was that there are students that had to wake up that day and sit in their bed and say, do I leave my dorm or not? Do I call home and say, Mom, send me a ticket or not? There are parents that were sitting there saying, do I go get my kid or do I let this pass, you know, some time pass to see what's going on? And then another thing I get concerned about, and you know, this isn't specific to the Missouri context, is there are administrators, faculty, and staff that are not capable of dealing with these needs.
Sure.
And I think we think a lot of the times that if we're trained in it, then we're good. But when we're talking about these very deep and nuanced situations, I think we overassume people's capability to handle things. And I think in those moments, it's important to bring in people who get it, and who are content experts and have experience on the ground with these types of things. And I think that there are a lot of universities that are just ill-equipped with that. And that's not, you know, a slam at any specific university. It's just that, like, if right now you said, hey, Dr. C, my computer's not working, could you come help me? Like, I can't, because I'm not a tech person. That's not my thing. I have a PhD, I'm smart as heck, but I can't help you with that. And I think right now we have a lot of institutions that feel like they can help, but they have a missing piece, you know? And you have to be able to be reflective as an organization and as a leader to be able to say, what's the missing piece? So that's why I like doing the work that I do, because I personally think I'm a missing piece, right? To be able to come in and kind of facilitate a lot of these conversations.
So research and scholarly work is often produced by individuals who have a similar identity to the need that's being researched, right? So how can we address people who are affected by these social injustices and bringing in with privileged identity?
So this is an interesting one for me, because anytime we have the conversation of privilege, I think it tends to lean white, right? That privilege is simply white. Now, we're very clear about the historical context of race in America, the historical context of European colonialism in the world, right? So I'm clear on that piece, right? White privilege matters in this world. But I think that certain things have changed and moved in ways that there's unseen privilege. And so if we keep assuming that the white male is the only privileged one in the room, then we're missing a piece. And the reason that I can kind of own that is if I'm thinking about like my own personal positionality statement, right? I was raised in privilege from a financial perspective. I grew up in a family of hardworking people, entrepreneurs, solid salaries. I traveled the world as a kid. My grandmother was an opera singer. I went to private schools. There wasn't anything in my childhood that I could have had more of. You get what I mean? And so when I am navigating in the world, it isn't simply my Blackness or simply my womanness that's operating. I'm coming from a place where I've had some privilege. Now, I was also raised in a family where Black consciousness was always on the table for conversation. Community activism was always on the table for conversation. And so all of the stories that I heard of my grandmother, my grandfather, my mom, involved in these activist-oriented, activities, I knew that no matter what privilege I had on the economic side, I'm a Black woman in America. Sure. And that comes with its own stuff. Because when I walk in the room, you don't know the fact that I came from an economically privileged background. But what you do see is a Black woman. And that is going to be the first layer of interaction. And so I think it's important for us to redefine privilege in order to help people acknowledge the privileges that they do have. I mean, I have a PhD. That warrants me a whole lot of privilege. But what it doesn't protect me from is my Black son, who may come from an economically privileged, educated household, walking down the street and being perceived as a thug and potentially getting shot for carrying Skittles. That doesn't stop that. And so for me, while understanding and acknowledging all of the diversity of privilege, it's also important to understand that there are certain identities that can't be hidden. And those surface level identities matter. And I think that's where we start talking about, how stigma impacts people and this conversation of stigma and privilege and how those two interact. And that being privileged is not a singular identity. It's not just like, oh, I'm privileged, right? We have so many identities, some that are, affirming, some that are threatening, some that have stigma, some that don't. And so I think that because for example, if a white male says, oh, I'm a white male, so I'm privileged, that's it. But there could be a whole lot of other things about that person that allows them to dig into an unprivileged identity set that allows their compassion to be able to build. So it isn't simply about race all the time. And I think that we kind of sit on race and gender a little bit too much when we talk about the privilege piece, at least in the context of how I look at it with self-awareness. Because the self-awareness piece says, I need to be clear of where my privileges lie, where they don't lie, where my stigmas lie, where they don't. And then find the nook that allows me to hook in with that other person. So that would be what I said.
Yesterday in your excellent keynote, you had mentioned there's not only collective identity, but there's also individual identity, right. And there's these two components of identity. Mm-hmm. And by developing our own individual identity, that can really help us with our voice and having a little bit more advocacy. So I'm wondering if you can also share with our viewers the individual versus collective identity.
Okay, so we all have our own identity profiles. And I think sometimes we think about identity, again, like I said, in this singular way. Like, I am Atira, but I'm not just Atira. I'm Atira who has a lot of different slices to her pie. Some of those identities are positive, some of those identities are negative. Some of those identities I may feel alone, some of those identities I may feel very connected to the people in that same slice. But I think a lot of times we're forced to operate in collective identity space before we've handled figuring out what our individual identity is. So it's very difficult for me to be a member of an organization or even of my family or of a university or of any different, context if I'm not clear on all of the things that make up who I am. Because then we start interacting in isolation. So if I'm in an organization full of college-educated Black women, if I am only interacting thinking that's the only thing that matters, now even as I interact in that space, I may be missing something. If that's our only mode of alignment and connection, right? So by understanding, oh, I'm also somebody that has point of view A, now it's, oh, let me try to find some other people with point of view A. Or understanding that, oh, I may not be vibing with her. Oh, it's because she's a point of view B and I'm point of view A. But if I don't realize that it's just the only difference between her and I is point of view A, point of view B, now I've created a whole nother issue that doesn't even really exist interpersonally. It's just that we have two different slices that right now aren't connecting. And I think that, in those moments where we have two identities that collide, people just simply avoid and isolate instead of finding another slice to try to figure out how to connect with. And then you add the collective identity piece in, and people now have to figure out not only who am I, but who am I in relationship to everybody else around me, right? And then there's also an assumption that that means the same thing. So I'm a Black educated woman. Does that mean that I can only align with other Black educated women? Or does that mean that every Black educated woman that I engage with and interact with will be similar to me, right? And, you know, I'm speaking from my own experience here. I think that we have to start to think about identity not just by category, but also by level of identification. You know, I'm a mom to 3 awesome kids under the age of 8. And when I think about that, you know, you have to think about, oh, what does it mean to be a mother? My definition is different than my best friend's, is different than my mom's, is different than my aunt's. So the assumption that any given identity is homogenous, I think is also a problem. So when we think about campuses that are, you know, creating programming, if we have the assumption that every Black student in the Black Student Union has the same needs, then we're missing the buck on that. Because there are gonna be students that have different needs. There are gonna be students that are, you know, are African immigrants, are West Indian, are first generation, are all of these things, up north, from down south. All of those different things add a different nuance to their Black identity, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the one programming for the one organization is going to be the right fit. So I think having diversity of programming, even within these, you know, specific identity groups, is important too.
So you mentioned the individual that might not get along with somebody else, and they don't necessarily know why. How can students learn to advocate for themselves in those situations, whether it's individual values, community values, or societal values? How can they advocate for themselves in those situations?
I think that they have to decrease some of the fear. And they have to decrease the fear of not being heard. Because the reality is you can't control whether you're going to be heard or not. But what you can control is trying to use your voice. Now, you may try to use your voice a couple of times and totally get shut down. But that doesn't mean you stop using your voice. And I think if there's anything that we can learn from other movements of other times, they didn't stop. It was consistency, right? They consistently used their voice. They consistently sat in. They consistently boycotted. They consistently, right? And I think one of the things we're missing in this current era is consistency. It's like, oh, it's on CNN. Oh, it's the hot thing. Oh, the cameras are around. Oh, hashtag blah, 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 blah. And then once that passes, it's on to the next, as if it never happened, or as if that specific community is not still dealing with the same thing. And, you know, I think that we just have to be more consistent in our activism, because I do think that's something that's missing now.
You mentioned Dr. Charles was a keynote speaker here at the 26th Annual Dalton Institute. Thank you so much again for your time and for sharing your thoughtful comments and reflections today.
Thanks, I really appreciate it. If anybody wants to contact me, they can find me on Twitter at Dr. Atira Charles. And if they want to check out the Mask Project, they can find me at ourmasks.com, OURMASKS.com.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.